Welcome to today's webinar, Pandemic Response, Meeting the Needs of Special Education Students. My name is David Nash. I'm the director of the Legal One program, and I'm very happy that we have such an esteemed panel for today's presentation. We have with me Barbara Gantwerk, who is the coordinator of special projects for our Foundation for Educational Administration. Barbara, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
John Worthington, a consultant with us here at Legal One, and prior to that was the director of the Office of Special Education for the New Jersey Department of Education. Thank you, John.
Oh, you're welcome.
We also have representatives from 2 different school districts who are engaged in some very effective practices that we wanted to make you aware of. So we have with us Teresa Taylor, Director of Special Education in Jackson Township. Thank you, Teresa.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
We also have Dr. Emily Sortino, Director of Secondary Special Education for the Livingston Public Schools. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. And Dr. Blair Rosenthal, Director of Elementary Special Education for Livingston Public Schools. Thank you as well, Blair.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So we are very appreciative that given all of the challenges that we know you are working through, all of the demands on your time, that you have chosen to spend this time with us to think through together how we address the needs of students with disabilities. As we walk through our webinar today, we're going to give you the very latest information, try to give you the best information we can on existing and evolving legal requirements and best practices. Of course, as we walk through our presentation today, it is not intended as legal advice. It is intended as a summary of law. We do encourage those of you who are NJPSA members, if you have specific questions, you can always reach out to NJPSA's legal department. For those of you across the board involved in school districts, we always encourage you to reach out to your school attorney for specific questions. NJPSA and FEA has recognized the huge challenges that we are all facing, and we want to be there to support you. So today's webinar is part of a series of webinars that we are providing, all free of charge, to try to help those in the field think through the many challenging issues that we're dealing with. So we will be offering a webinar tomorrow, April 2nd, on addressing HIB and discrimination claims. We will be offering another webinar on Monday, April 6th, on addressing student mental health and counseling needs. We are also looking to schedule a webinar, which we potentially may have on Friday of this week, on addressing observation and evaluation. And we are looking to put in place another webinar that goes into greater detail on student confidentiality, potentially for Tuesday of next week. We are also trying to provide more extensive professional development opportunities through Zoom workshops that will also be free to those in the field. So we wanted to make you aware of a number of free workshops that we are offering between now and April 17th through Zoom. With that, let me turn to Barbara Gantwerk to get us started on today's presentation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. First, I want to say how much we recognize the uncharted nature of what we're doing here and the challenges. There are normally challenges in providing FAPE, free appropriate public education to students with disabilities. And so in a pandemic like this and school closure, those challenges are even greater. And we know how difficult it has been and how hard everyone has worked to shift from public school brick and mortar buildings to this new platform that we're on. And so we really want to bring you some of the information and discuss these issues. And the USDE has provided considerable guidance, and that guidance stresses flexibility and the recognition that we're in an emergency situation, not a normal situation. We want to review a number of the issues that are involved in this and look at these issues as how we're providing students with disabilities appropriate programs during this school closure. And we want to look at it in a manner that we believe recognizes the fact that to meet the letter and spirit of this law, IDEA, our state laws, that we do this now by keeping our eyes on the prize and by keeping the best interests of the student as the focus of all of our issues. And so while there may be conflicting guidance, questions, concerns, if we focus and know that we'll be meeting the law by doing what we believe is in the best interest of students, we think we're going to get to the right place. We also are very fortunate to have, as David said, directors of special education and special services with us to talk about how this is being accomplished at a district level, specifically for students, and look at even some examples of how services are being provided to some of the students with our greatest challenges. Next. Next slide. So the USDE has provided us guidance, and it's clearly, bottom line is that when schools provide educational opportunities during a closure, students with disabilities should have equal access to the same opportunities. So we say, and they say, if online instruction is available to our gen ed students, then it would be available to students with disabilities as well. So it's not just online instruction, but we think about what does that mean to provide the access. So let's say a district is providing packets. They're providing packets of information to all of their students. To ensure that students with disabilities have access to it, it would require, obviously, that they can do it, that they have the modifications and accommodations that would be necessary to assist them. So when we talk about having access, we're talking about access, being able to engage. And the next phrase is very important now that the feds are talking about, and we all are, to the greatest extent possible. We want students to be able to be provided the special ed and related services in their IEP to the greatest extent possible, meaning that we recognize, everyone recognize that these are unusual circumstances and it cannot be the same. So recognizing that it cannot be the same, we have to consider all delivery options and provide what's feasible. But the important issue that is being brought out in a lot of this guidance, that virtual or online instruction is a legitimate option to deliver special education services. Now, the next, the USDE memo spoke about the fact that the USDE does not want to stand in the way of good faith efforts to educate students online. I think this demonstrated that there was confusion across the country in what could be provided to students with disabilities, and specifically in this area of online services. So it's important to think about good faith efforts. That's what this is all about, and that concept we are going to keep in mind, and that all available flexibilities will be provided. That's what the USDE is saying. Now, we don't know yet exactly what that means. We're not sure what all of the flexibilities will be. There are a number of flexibilities that have already been given, and we're going to discuss them in this webinar. But I think if this goes on longer, and obviously it's going to, there may be more guidance and more flexibilities that are provided. But again, clearly it's saying that distance instruction online should be provided, and they keep stressing the fact that no federal law should be read as preventing it, and that's including IDEA, 504, ADA. And I think it's, again, saying that our focus is on providing services. Our decisions are made based on the ability to provide services. So the next slide, obviously, they're clearly in favor of distance online learning during this emergency. They're going to offer flexibility, and that FAPE, free appropriate public education, may include special education and related services provided through distance instruction, virtually, online, or telephonically. Now, we're also recognizing that students with disabilities need modifications, accommodations, and those may also be provided online where appropriate. And key here again, that they say educators may still meet their legal obligations by providing children with disabilities equally effective alternate access to the curriculum or services provided. Stressing that we know FAPE may look different. FAPE will look different when schools are closed, and that we have to consider creative alternative ways to provide the services to students with disabilities. And on the next slide, the point to make is to also keep in mind that decisions are still made individually, and it's based on appropriateness, safety issues, specific student concerns. IDEA at its heart is an individual decision-making process for each student. And that remains during these times also. So while one program may be appropriate for one student, it's not going to be appropriate for the next. And we're going to, again, be creative and think of ways to provide access. Now we're talking about FAPE, and or at least I am. And when we think about FAPE, next, we have a standard. Now this standard that has been given to us through the Supreme Court case of Andrew, among other things, speaks about a program being appropriately ambitious in light of the circumstance. So we have to think about what does that mean in developing and providing programs. Providing a program does not automatically mean the student can access or can be engaged in the program without the support, with the guidance. So, for example, if you're providing packets to students, now schools are doing a million different things. They're working so hard at finding ways to engage students and give them the services that they need. And sometimes they're doing it through packets. So we have to think about, if you are providing that, there has to be along with it consultation. The packets have to be reviewed. The modifications and supports may also be needed in order for a student to really engage with that material and for it to be useful. The old phones, some of us remember phones, and these, we need to phone parents if they have no access to computers. And I know that everybody is trying to do this, but these are ways also to make sure that the material we're given. And the reason I mention it is because when schools come back, and they will, and hopefully soon, the issue of compensatory service is going to be raised. John's going to address that in a bit. And so we want to think about it now when we're providing programs to ensure that students can access them, be engaged in them, and they are providing something meaningful. And we know that's challenging for many of our students. Now, I do want to talk about related services, because this has been an area of much confusion. And I want to tell you how we've been thinking about it. And today we do have some breaking news. So, as I said before, the USDE clearly recognized that online distance learning can meet the needs of some students. The federal government was not, too confused about this. They recognized that during these exceptional circumstances, we will, as we said before, change the way services are delivered. And our view and the position that we, suggested was that there may be some confusion. I think now we will be able to say that confusion is clarified and gone, but that you make the decision based, again, on providing services to students. If we're going to err, if we're going to make a mistake, if we think of it that way, we'll make the mistake to benefit students, to be able to provide the services. That's the good faith effort that we're talking about. So now for related services, today, the clouds have lifted, the sun is shining. The State Department of Education has passed an emergency regulation today that's in effect today. So this is wonderfully timely of us to be able to tell you if you don't already know. And that emergency regulation allows related services to be provided online. It permits school districts, clinics, and agencies to deliver related services through virtual, remote, or other online platforms. And it says, again, that these shall be provided as appropriate and as required by the student's IEP, again, to the greatest extent possible. And the last bullet on this page, I think, is important because what it says is really responding to the position that we felt was appropriate, is that doing this through these platforms ensures with students with disabilities are provided the services they are entitled to. So again, it says providing the services is the way you meet the requirements of this law. So we're all very pleased. I know the department was working very hard to get this passed because everyone recognized that this was in the best interest of students and we should be able to do that. Now, we should note that this emergency reg, which is temporary, it's in effect as long as the schools are closed, is not just, it doesn't say just speech and counseling. So it's for all services, related services. And that means related services may be provided in a variety of ways. I know that districts are being very creative in the way that they're providing these services. It can be provided in groups, it can be provided individually, certainly in coordination with parents, certainly in consideration of safety issues. And it's always, again, based on the individual needs and the appropriateness of the methodology for the student. That's the heart of this whole decision. It doesn't, this law. So it doesn't mean it's right for every student to do the same way. And for some students, this will make the difference. We'll be able to provide the services that schools were struggling to provide. They wanted to do this for the longest time. I know that you have said you wanted to do this. So we see this as a very positive step. Now, in all of this, we see that, again, you make that good faith effort, just as you're trying to do. You're flexible, you're creative, and you meet the needs of the individual students to the greatest extent possible. Those are the ways we consider and move forward. Now, there are issues that certainly are raised and have been raised, a number of them, and some of them are importantly confidentiality and issues of privacy, and that's not just for related services or students with disabilities, but for all students. And so given that, I want to now turn this back to David to discuss these issues and others.
Thank you very much, Barbara. As we move into this part of the discussion, we do want to recognize the tremendous effort that all districts across the state have been making and the real struggle that districts are having at trying to balance competing interests. There is a compelling interest, of course, for us to provide ongoing services for all students to make sure we are supporting students with disabilities. There are also very important interests that come with protecting student privacy and making sure that we are not in any inappropriate way releasing student records and releasing privacy information regarding any particular student. So we're going to try to help you think about ways that we balance those different interests and still support our students moving forward. As we think about that, we also do need to think about the social and emotional learning of our students. And we do have specific case law that talks about how courts are recognizing how critical social and emotional learning is to ensuring a free and appropriate public education. And that remote instruction can be one effective means of helping to make sure students are not isolated, to facilitate social interaction, to help the students' emotional well-being. So that becomes a critical consideration for us as well. It's also important to think about the issue of least restrictive environment. And by doing everything possible to engage our students with disabilities through virtual learning, we're doing everything we can to keep those students connected with the entire student body and make sure that we do educate students in that least restrictive environment. The good news is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. These issues are being effectively addressed. That's part of the reason that we have some wonderful panelists today to talk about some best practices And we also have some very strong guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that should help folks across the state feel more secure in providing remote services for our students. So it's interesting, we have case law that goes back to 2017 that actually is very instructive today in thinking through issues of providing remote instruction and services for students. So this was a case that involved a medically fragile student, a 14-year-old freshman student. Student had some very serious health issues, was unable to attend school in person over an extended period of time. The district did offer home instruction, did offer a flexible schedule for the student, but the student and the student's parent were pushing for more. They were asking for the ability to virtually participate in school. In this particular case, that virtual participation would have been through a VGO robot that allowed the student to simulate moving throughout the school building, interacting with peers throughout the school day, virtually participating in classes throughout that day. And the school district had taken the position that the student could receive a free appropriate public education without that option. Ultimately, the administrative law judge that was looking at this case held that the robot that was asked for in this particular case was necessary for a free appropriate public education. And we're talking about this case today because it has tremendous relevance as we think about the provision of remote instruction. So in Warren Hills, in order to address this issue, in order to implement this particular requirement, the district did put in place a policy to govern the use of this robot, of this virtual technology. And I think there's some important guidelines in that district policy that districts across the state could think about. So for example, one of the requirements in the district policy was that the student needs to remain visible at all times when we do have that virtual instruction taking place where we are directly engaging with the student. And the student, just like if the student was in school and had to excuse himself or herself to use a restroom, the student here would request permission to remove himself for any particular reason. The student obviously wouldn't go into private areas like restrooms or locker rooms with that robot. Or change other changing areas. The student can control the robot, and only the student would control the robot. There would be no recordings. That's an important point when we're using various virtual technologies. When we record a session, when we record virtual instruction that's going on, now we are creating student records that are governed by FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. To the extent that we have remote instruction happening without that recording, that is not considered a student record under FERPA. And of course, the district did retain the right to monitor the way the technology was being used by the student. If the student did something inappropriate with that technology, did not follow those rules, the district would reserve the right to impose discipline. So the district in this case made a number of arguments that we're hearing today as well. The first argument was very particular to that robot. There were safety concerns about moving something throughout a building. Perhaps there would be an issue with the robot not having peripheral vision and potentially bumping into another student. Obviously, with the vast majority of the issues that we're talking about today, that wouldn't be a concern. But confidentiality concerns are very relevant to what we're discussing here today. District was concerned that it wouldn't have the ability to control who else was going to see any virtual instruction that was happening. And potentially somebody else in that household might see what's going on. So I'll talk about that issue and how the court analyzed it. The district raised the issue that a student, is medically fragile and on any particular day might miss that day, might fall further behind. And the teacher, of course, is continuing with instruction next day, and that could create some additional challenges. District pointed out that technology isn't perfect. We all know that. Things break down. And what if there was some interruption in services because the technology broke down for some period of time? And the district raised a concern that perhaps a student would have less motive to return to school. If you had a student, for example, who was dealing with anxiety issues, there was a fear that maybe this would be a crutch for that student, and the student would be less likely to come back to school. There was this general fear that this particular case might be a slippery slope. Now everybody will want to have this particular technology if it was provided for this particular student. And the district argued that, it doesn't have to provide the very best possible education anybody could imagine. It just has to provide some meaningful benefit for the student, and home instruction could provide that. In many ways, those arguments are analogous to the situation that we're dealing with today. We have students with disabilities who are unable to physically interact with their peers, just like we had in this particular case with one particular student. We have the concern that perhaps somebody else in the home may be viewing the video if you have that kind of live instruction is happening. We can't control the information that other students might share during a discussion. Perhaps another student shares information regarding one of their classmates that is private information. One of the key challenges, of course, today, or one of the key differences, is that this is really more of a universal challenge. We are all in the same boat, trying to make sure that all students are able to connect remotely. As the court analyzed this case, it did cite a lack of due diligence on the part of the school district from their point of view. The court held that the district seemed predisposed against the idea of providing virtual instruction for improper reasons, because of some of the logistical challenges, because of some of the unforeseen issues that the district was struggling with. So the court was very concerned that the district had not engaged in due diligence, had not properly investigated how well this was working in many other districts, because there is information out there about other districts that were already using similar technologies. The court pointed out that we do have, in this particular case, a paraprofessional aide who is assigned to that student, and perhaps the district should think creatively about the role of that paraprofessional aide and having that aide assist with any technology issues that might come up in order to help that student. The court pointed out that there was a failure to appreciate the value of group learning, the importance of social opportunities and human interaction as part of FAPE, and ultimately found that the district's lack of due diligence, their inability to think creatively about these issues, to investigate how it had been done successfully in other places, really resulted in a failure to provide that student with the least restrictive environment. And of course, there were these confidentiality concerns, but the court held that those were misplaced and that those are issues that were not insurmountable, that could be overcome. So that's an important part of thinking about this particular case and applying it more broadly. How do we overcome those obstacles? One of the documents that we provided to you was just released in March of this year by the U.S. Department of Education, and it helps us think through FERPA issues and virtual learning. And U.S. Department of Education points out that under FERPA, the determination of who can observe a virtual classroom, similar to an in-person classroom, is a local school decision, and that teachers generally do not disclose personally identifiable information from a student's education record during classroom instruction. We're not supposed to be releasing to other students in that classroom personal, private information about that particular student, including the fact that the student has a disability, even though other students might separately know that. We're not supposed to be releasing that type of information. And U.S. Department of Ed very specifically said FERPA neither requires nor prohibits individuals from observing a classroom, whether it is a physical classroom or a virtual classroom. And we give you a link here to a letter that was sent to an attorney with the Education Law Center that talked about how classroom observations certainly can be done by a parent, by a professional that the parent is working with to try to assess the needs of their child, by somebody else who's coming into that setting for appropriate reasons, that we can have others observing that classroom, and there is no violation of either FERPA or IDEA. And that was important with this letter that came out, letter to mamas. That was a 2003 letter, but it still applies today. And the U.S. Department of Education made clear that that letter still applies today in a virtual setting, and that even if somebody else was observing that classroom, there would not be a violation of FERPA or IDEA. We also have to think through the potential discrimination claims that could come if we're not doing everything possible to make sure that students are fully able to access education and that we're not considering the available technology. So the Office for Civil Rights put out guidance on March 16th of this year in trying to help districts think through how to respond to this pandemic, that accessible technology may afford students, including students with disabilities, the opportunity to have access to high quality educational instruction during an extended school closure, especially when continuing education must be provided through distance learning. So very important that the Office for Civil Rights has said that we need to be considering available technologies as one way to make sure that students with disabilities have access to a high quality education. Office for Civil Rights also pointed out that failure to address bullying claims involving students with disabilities could be a violation of federal anti-discrimination law, including Section 504 Title VI. Now, the U.S. Department of Ed and the Office for Civil Rights did point out that if a district is not providing virtual instruction for any students, there would not be a separate requirement to do so for students with disabilities. But we really don't see that in the state of New Jersey. For the vast majority of school districts and kids, there is some virtual instruction that is happening. And when that is happening, we need to look at ways to make sure it's happening for students with disabilities as well. With that, let me turn this back over, I believe, to Barbara.
No, David, it's John.
I'm sorry, to John.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to go over a few areas before it goes back to Barbara: mediation, due process, complaint investigations, a little bit about compensatory services, and initial evaluations and reevaluations. So talking a little about U.S. Department of Education guidance. Do know they've talked about state complaint investigations. They have a very strict timeline, 60-day timeline to conduct complaint investigations. They have recognized that the parties can agree to extend that timeline, or in extraordinary circumstances, you can extend the timeline for complaint investigations. This being a worldwide pandemic is likely to fall within the extraordinary circumstance exception. So in all likelihood, complaint investigations will not be able to proceed unless the state is able to investigate it and obtain documents without the need to go on site. Most of them, if not all, will be extended. With regard to mediation due process hearings, my understanding is right now mediations have been put on hold. At some point during the resolution period, when due process claims are filed and you're mediating cases, they're probably going to have to look into holding mediations as we're doing today in some virtual manner in order to move them along. So at the moment, they're not moving, is my understanding, but they will soon probably have to if it continues too long. Same with regard to due process hearings. The administrative law judge in the hearing has always had the ability, if a party makes a request, they can extend the timeline for the hearing, and so they can continue to do that. I believe they're looking now into conducting virtual hearings, which might not be the best way to do a hearing when everyone's appearing like we are today at your homes. It's going to be difficult to get witness testimony and the like, but it might come to the point, if things delay too long, where they might start having to do the hearings that way. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Next slide.
Give me 1 second.
So with regard to compensatory services, no, it's not an issue yet. It's addressed by all the guidance, but when the school closures end at some point, which they will, this will become an issue for school districts with respect to compensatory services for special education students. So certainly how you serve the students now, how things are happening, and I would note, stepping back, it's great that now you can do the related services online, which will certainly help a lot in order to allow you to serve them to the greatest extent possible. But at a certain point, the issue of are compensatory services required for any student, it will become an issue. Do note, reading the guidance from both the state and federal Department of Education, you're going to be looking at individual circumstances. Nothing has said every single student must receive compensatory services. You look at the individual circumstances, determine whether a meeting is appropriate for the student, and then determine whether compensatory services may be required for the student. Note in the second bullet, though, certainly if you're educating your students through the internet, virtual instruction, and the student doesn't have internet connectivity or is unable to receive instruction, related services, whatever it might be, in the way the district is doing so for other students, in that case, you will need to have a meeting when this is over in order to determine what compensatory services may be required for the student, to get them to the point where they can continue to receive a FAPE-free appropriate public education going forward. We have put together some questions for you to look at, some things to consider when it's time to look into compensatory services. One, I think in here, the second one, was there a disproportionate impact on the students with disabilities as compared to other students? That's going to be a big question because you're going to look at all students. There could be either a failure to receive or progress as much as they might have ordinarily, or perhaps some students may even regress during this time. It's hard to say depending on the instruction, but you want to look at the impact on that student as compared to other students, because during this time where you're using a lot of different ways to try to instruct students while your schools are closed, there's obviously going to be an impact on all students. So you're really looking a little bit more at what was the impact on this student and how did it affect them on our compensatory services required. Next slide. Some other questions to look into. So, you want to look at how the services were provided. Look at the second bullet. Were they as beneficial for the student as methods normally utilized? You might have provided your related services in person. Now you're providing them online. It's possible that doing that way will still be as beneficial, but it's something you need to look at. Documentation, I think, will be very important. It's always important in special ed. You have to document what you do, but you're going to need your staff members, whether it's related service providers, teachers, and the like, make sure they're documenting the services, when they were provided, how they were provided, the amount of time. You're going to want to keep track of all of that. It may even become relevant if you're participating in the SEMI program, Special Education Medicaid Initiative. You'll want to keep that in mind. You need to document the services in order to bill for the services through the SEMI program. So always keep that in mind. You have to look at, did the student regress during the closure? Did they just fail to make as much progress as you might have expected? You're going to have to look at what happened. Is there a possibility the student will require an extended school year? Maybe the student normally doesn't receive an extended school year, but say that schools do reopen by the end of the year. Perhaps for some students, you might want to consider providing an ESY program, which will get them to the point they need to be to receive their FAPE going forward at the end of the summer. And also the last bullet's important. Are any new issues with regard to special education needs for the student? Did the closure cause any new needs? So it's something you will want to look into. And do take a look at the note on the bottom. Remember, when you're considering compensatory services, it's not necessarily going to be one-to-one, hour-for-hour type services. So if you maybe get a little bit less of a related service, less hours of instruction, you're not necessarily going to automatically say every hour missed has to be made up as part of compensatory services. Instead, you're going to look at it as, what does the student need to get them to the point where they can continue to receive a FAPE-free appropriate public education going forward? And that's how you want to analyze it, as opposed to one-to-one for every hour of any service that was different or that might have been missed. Finally, note that if there is a delay, the U.S. Department of Education specifically notes you have to consider compensatory services if there's a delay in providing services or making the decision. So in that circumstance, it's not going to be individually based. If you've delayed in serving the student, you're going to have to consider compensatory services, whether they're appropriate in that instance. And note in the final bullet, this has come up a little. The fact that you're providing services in some manner, whether it's online, through packages, whatever methodology you're using, that does not automatically mean you won't owe compensatory services. It is something that has to be considered when appropriate for all students. And just because you serve, which everyone is doing, which is great, it's not going to automatically mean that you do not have to provide compensatory services. You look at the questions we discussed, and it will be an individual determination whether you need to meet and whether services should be provided for the student.
Thank you, John. So with that, we're going to pause for a moment. Folks, I think, have started to notice this. I should have pointed it out at the beginning of our webinar. There is an option for individuals to type in questions as we go. Of course, we do have over 1,000 attendees, so we may not be able to answer all questions, but we will try to address some of the questions as we go and capture other questions to the extent that we can. So one of the questions that was asked in this first segment, are there concerns regarding privacy issues as far as FERPA and HIPAA when providing services virtually to a group? So it's a very good question, and we get that question about FERPA and HIPAA very often. What is clear is that the vast majority of information that school districts have is governed by FERPA, by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It is not governed by HIPAA. And the U.S. Department of Education has put out guidance on FERPA and HIPAA. And of course, when you have an instructor or another professional working with a group of students, that individual really is supposed to work to not disclose specific health information regarding that student to other students. So that should not be overtly happening in any group work that is going on. And the U.S. Department of Education has said that those group discussions do not violate FERPA. They do not raise HIPAA issues unless the instructor is making a choice that should not be made and making a choice to share personal medical information regarding a particular student. So as long as the instructor doesn't do that, we would not have that particular concern. I did see another question that was raised that will be addressed in a later portion of our presentation regarding issues of testing and some of the limitations that we could have with remote instruction when it comes to testing. So we'll hold off on addressing that issue. And I see that various versions of that question being asked by a number of participants. So with that, we will have a couple of additional opportunities to review potential questions, but I think we will, at this point, move on to initial evaluations.
Okay, thank you, David. So yes, with regard to initial evaluations, just a little bit of information. You can see on this slide, the U.S. Department of Education doesn't have a specific timeline. However, in New Jersey, as you know, the time to complete the initial evaluations, you have 90 days from consent to implement the program. However, do note the U.S. Department of Education specifically recognizes there is going to be some flexibility provided, as Barbara was stressing earlier, with regard to meeting timelines in extraordinary circumstances, which these certainly are. And so certainly with regard to an initial eval and the requirements that are part of that, you're probably not going to be able to finish initial evals. But if we go to the next slide, however, even though you can't finish initial evals, districts have inquired, well, should they be conducted at all? And the suggestion we would provide is, you should initiate the initial evaluation, complete any parts of it that you can, and then leave the remaining parts of an initial eval perhaps to be completed when the schools reopen. You know, there's many components of the initial evaluation in the regulations, one of them being a minimum of 2 assessments, which is doubtful you're going to be able to conduct assessments of students while the schools are closed. However, there are other components of the initial evaluation that you may be able to complete during the closure of the schools. If we go to the next slide. I want to stress first, when necessary, student record information is accessible, because keep in mind, you'll have your child study team members will be leading the process with regard to initial evals. However, they're going to have to be able to access student record information in order to complete certain work. So depending on the amount of access they have while working remotely, there are certain things they should be able to do. You can certainly conduct parent and teacher interviews. You can review developmental academic history, you review interventions, things like that documented by teachers. Your school nurse, if you look at the final bullet, certainly the summary of available health information is something that can be completed even while the schools are closed. You might be able to prepare portions of written reports with regard to the initial evaluation, although you might not be able to complete the whole process. You could engage in tasks such as that, and then when the schools reopen and you're able to conduct the assessment, because that's the part it does not appear is going to be able to work. You'll need to be with the student in order to conduct the testing and assessments, and there's a minimum of 2. So that portion may have to be held, but you should complete the other components that you can, and then complete the initial evaluation when you're able to, when schools have reopened. Now, reevaluations are similar. Again, you should, when doing the reevaluation, complete any parts of it that you can. And then if there are components of the reevaluation you cannot complete, such as assessments, again, you could certainly complete them when schools reopen. But there are a couple of differences here. Remember, a reevaluation does not require a minimum number of assessments. It doesn't require any assessments at all. So it's possible you could have a meeting of the IEP team. If the team and the parent determine no assessments are necessary, and you're going to make the determination based on data that are available, you can complete the reevaluation process without the need to delay until schools reopen. In addition, there is a provision in the rules that allows the reevaluation to be waived, which means there's no meetings, no document review. You make the request to the parent, waive the reevaluation. If consent is provided by the parent, you time the next 3-year triennial evaluation period from the date of consent. So if it is going to be waived, certainly a district would be able to complete that process while the schools are closed also. And on the last slide, just note here too, the U.S. Department of Education has certainly recognized that you can complete components of reevaluation. I think there's talking about it can be completed unless it's determined additional assessments are needed. They talk about it may occur without the need for a meeting. Do know in our regulations in 6A14.3.8, the IEP team makes certain determinations, so the team would need to meet, but team meetings is something Barbara is going to address further on in the presentation. And so the meeting, you could still hold the meeting and complete the reevaluation. Again, if no assessments are needed, reevaluations could be completed during the closure. And now I'll turn it over to Barbara.
Hi, David, I was wondering, in the interest of time, if we could have our next question period after our 2 districts speak. Would that be okay?
Of course, absolutely.
Okay, great. Okay, let me just say a little bit about IEP meetings, because our state regulations do not specifically provide for holding these meetings by audio or video conference, but clearly doing that in the current circumstance would be very reasonable, and also would meet the obligation to do what you're supposed to do regarding these meetings. So we recommend that you amend the plan that you submitted to the NJDOE to include holding these IEP meetings through audio video conference. Obviously, it's with parental consent. And next slide. And holding these meetings, you should hold these meetings through audio and video only if the parent consents, and a parent may wish to not do that and may wish to wait until the school opens again to have the meeting in person. And if they wish to do that, certainly you can. And clearly you do this only when the school is not in session, and always document the need and reason for holding it by audio or video conference. And I just want to talk a minute about paraprofessionals before I turn it over to our two districts, because we've received a lot of questions and about how to include the paraprofessionals in this online instruction and services. And so while we know that many districts have told us they're doing a lot of professional development for their paraprofessionals at this time, which is always wonderful, we think some districts are demonstrating really great ways of including the paraprofessionals in supporting individual students. Some of them are having the paraprofessionals log into the virtual classrooms, and they're assisting individual students. They're contacting parents at home, having video chats or by the phone, and they're doing breakout rooms through Zoom to work with students on a one-to-one assistance basis. So we think there are lots of creative ways that we're seeing, and we know that as districts move forward in these online platforms, there will be more ways to do that. And this is a perfect time to turn to the districts, because we have two districts that are doing so many different ways to serve students, that I want to turn this over now to Dr. Blair Rosenthal and Dr. Emily Sortino from Worthington, and then we will hear from Dr. Teresa Taylor from Jackson.
Wonderful. So to prepare for remote learning, we brainstormed the large scale first and then moved to the smaller scale thinking. We had an overall goal of maintaining academic excellence, special education programming, and we really had a large emphasis on having daily contact with our students. That was a priority for us. If we want to go to the next slide. We specifically started thinking about the devices. This was all prior to the closure, when we began to plan and facilitate how we would distribute all of the devices one-to-one in grades 2 through 12, as well as how would we provide internet access for our families who did not have access to Wi-Fi. So all of that was done in advance of the closure, which helped to facilitate a really seamless instructional experience for all of our students. We modified our school day, both in the elementary and secondary world, to a shortened day schedule, which allowed for teachers to see students more regularly, and for our related service providers to have scheduled sessions with students that they could work into the schedule. All of those things, the pre-planning really helped that when we went remote learning, it began pretty smoothly in the beginning. So next slide. On March 10th, we had originally scheduled a delayed opening that was in our calendar for the full year. We moved that instead to a full day professional development for all of our staff. During that March 10th PD day, we worked really hard on gathering all the materials we would need for remote instruction. We trained all of our staff members on various learning platforms that they would need to use during the remote learning experience. For example, GoGuardian, Google Meet, Screencast-O-Matic, Nearpod, Flipgrid, Edpuzzle, Hello Smart, Schoology conferences, whatever we thought would be instructionally sound for staff, we made sure to have all the available tools and training on that March 10th day. We also gave the teachers a ton of time to work together to share all their resources and materials that they planned on using during remote learning. And we also created a district-wide remote learning shared drive. This was particularly important for our child study team members and related service providers, where we had forms that we would need. We had all of our frequently asked questions. We had all of our related service people putting all of their materials of how they would deliver those services remotely in one space for everyone to access. And next slide. After laying the groundwork, we really started focusing on assessment practices and the long-term sustainability of how we would provide remote instruction for our students. We began to provide remote professional development via faculty and department meetings, and we've continued regular conversations with staff on Zoom and Google Meet. That has allowed us to really maintain a sense of community with our staff, as well as provide the ongoing professional development that they would need. The technology department in Livingston also increased our licensing and software options to allow staff to have full access to a variety of online instructional tools, specifically GoGuardian, Zoom, Google, Screencast-O-Matic, and Nearpod. Those were the ones we focused on the most. And as part of the thinking forward approach, we began to enhance our use of the instructional aids via remote instruction. So we used Zoom breakout rooms for one-to-one and small group instruction. The Zoom breakout rooms in particular have been beneficial for us because we've had the teachers there to oversee all of that work and provide the whole class instruction while also having the breakout room experience. So it's allowed the direct supervision of that small group instruction work. We also worked with the staff pretty intensely on the closed captioning options that are available within Google Classroom as well as Zoom. This allowed us to have, for all of us to be sure that all students could access the materials and that there was accessibility for all. We maintained our regular meeting schedule for staff through virtual tools to allow for our connection, planning, and troubleshooting as a group. And this really helped keep our staff feeling supported and the sense of community that we're known for. It also allowed us to answer questions that many of our staff members were having in a really effective way. So I'll let Dr. Blair Rosenthal take over after that. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about our program. So our vision for this time period was to do everything we were doing in general education, plus whatever was needed for our students and what was dictated through their programs and IEPs. For students in our ABA programs, we, with a few days to go, started to create maintenance programs based on work that they had done in the schools. There's a lot of students who receive in-home parent training in this fashion. So we created maintenance programs from our school-based activities to send home with materials so that when our teachers were able to engage with students, if they were able, we had the program set up ready to go. We also asked our teachers to create instructional videos for students, things that they could watch, skill and strategy-based work, so that students would be able to revisit it and share it through the email in our younger grades and through Schoology platform for our older students. As Emily mentioned, across the programs, teachers are using Zoom in various capacities. As you could imagine, based on the student need, the interactions vary. We are doing Zoom with preschool, and so that's going to look different, certainly, than Zoom with our older students, but the staff are trying to differentiate to provide access because, as Emily mentioned, it's super important to us that we're maintaining contact with our families. Parents were asked to send videos or pictures to demonstrate work as celebrations and in an effort to have some sort of way to document work completion. Next slide, please. We also created individual plans for communicating with families. So one thing that we realized really quickly, if you are a parent of a child with a disability and there are two other children in the home and you're both working parents, there are a lot of emails happening and a lot of responsibilities. And so our staff had to be quick to adjust what the conversation was going to be like with parents and what the parents needed. We take for granted sometimes that in the schools we have reward systems, picture activity schedules, expectations laid out. As a mother of a kindergartner right now, I did not have those in the home like our classroom teachers would. And so it was really incumbent upon our staff to help parents create these as a means to have some level of normalcy for the students of what they're accustomed to and some sort of way for there to be an addressing of the behavior piece that would certainly, impact our students in their home environment. Our staff also used a Google Drive as well as Schoology to create sort of a hub where all our materials were and places for students could also respond through Google Classroom. Each teacher is required to do 1 hour of mandatory office hours a day because we're running a shortened day. Teachers have that within their contract so that parents knew that that was the hour each day, and the teachers varied it and also tried to be accessible to working parents. They have not because we've said they had to, but because they wanted to. If a parent needs a conversation in the evening, our teachers have been flexible to try and accommodate that for what's in the best interest of the kids. Certainly our behaviorists and counseling staff are being utilized to provide support to the parents, a lot of counseling to the parents. This is a crisis for them, and navigating it with students with really significant needs requires extra support. So they've been utilizing their services to help the parents and figure out what makes the most sense to be beneficial as an environment for their children. Next slide, please. We kept all staff on payroll and we decided that we were not going to cancel any sessions the first 10 days when this was initially a 2-week process of shutdown was in regards to maintenance programming and get everyone also comfortable with the process of what this would look like. As I'm sure you are all experiencing, staff were very reticent the first few days about how this was going to work. And so it took a little while for people to figure out what rhythm would work for them. They shared lessons with families and figured out how to remotely monitor student work. We've highly relied on the visual connections with our own staff too, to see them. The isolation for our staff, I think, is real, especially in an industry where we're used to seeing people all the time. So we're connecting with staff, and the staff are connecting with the parents to make sure they can be seen visually as well. And phone calls and emails. We're really trying to differentiate our support. So if parents say that the Google Meet or the Zoom is too much for them, then we're communicating with them via email or through a phone call, whatever is going to help them to the best extent possible. Okay. And then we're also doing a lot of just modeling. So our therapists are creating videos that they are modeling skills so that children can watch that and play it over. They are using Zoom activities when appropriate. The conversation with related services has been, pick the modality that makes the most sense based on the goals and objectives in the IEP. Not everything needs to be live. Not everything needs to be pre-recorded. Certain things are paper, pencil, depending on their area. But they are also joining when the classroom is doing Zoom activities to provide support that way, like if they were doing an integrated session. We have stressed the importance of documentation in terms of contact, because as folks mentioned earlier, we will have to make determinations later on about what services were given and what more is needed. Anything that we can do to make things more collaborative. We might have an ABA teacher who does a read aloud, and then the speech activity is based on the read aloud as a means to make things supplemental, and also not to have the parents feel like there's so many activities coming to them at one time, because a lot of our families have unfortunately expressed they're so overwhelmed both personally and professionally. And whatever targeted instruction, the related service providers can also be involved through Google or through lessons. They're using their discretion and collaborating with the teachers as they would have been if they were in the building. Everything is with the mindset of what can we do to best enhance the student's experience given the circumstances that we're in right now.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate hearing about the comprehensive system that you're putting in place. Now we'd like to turn it over to Dr. Teresa Taylor, please.
Hi, everyone. Our district is Jackson Township, and we have used similar strategies and supports that Livingston did. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with a lot of the same supports we offered, and I'll focus more on some of the different ones. You can go to the next slide. So first, Jackson is a pretty diverse district. We do have more than 27% who are free and reduced lunch. Pretty high numbers of special ed, over 1,500. And we have a decent amount of families that are Spanish speaking. You know, our L students are only 262, but we have a lot of families where the parents are primary Spanish speaking, even if their children no longer qualify for L services. You can go to the next slide. So in talking about some of the challenges we've had, you know, right now, definitely access to technology has been an issue. We were not a one-to-one district, but we are attempting to give access to technology to all of the families who need it. So far, we have distributed over 600 Chromebooks. A certain percentage of those also had Wi-Fi for families who didn't have internet service. Even to that end, we still have a decent number of students. And when I look at their names, the majority, about half, are Spanish speaking. Our communications have been in both languages for the most part. Our outreach has been in both languages. You know, some of what has happened is I'm aware that a percentage of our Spanish speaking population cannot read in Spanish either. So it doesn't automatically provide information sharing when we share things in Spanish. We have used staff who do speak Spanish and are native speakers. communicate. That's been helpful. But there are also cultural differences in terms of understanding that school is compulsory, which many countries where our families originate, education is not compulsory. So that's been part of the information sharing we've had to do along the way to help move families along and participate. We do have some families that have transportation issues. We try to have people come and pick up Chromebooks. In the event that someone really doesn't have transportation, we have delivered both meals, free and reduced lunch, and devices as needed by our transportation office. Let's see, other challenges that have happened. Definitely the whole overnight adjustment has been, I think everyone has felt that. It wasn't so much that we just closed, is that we closed pretty quickly. And it was a pretty large hurdle for not just for parents, but for teachers and staff to have to transition over to technology learning. Initially, a lot of teachers were using Google Classroom and had packets like most districts did for assignments that were available through Google Classroom. For special ed, many of them actually got printed out packets, or for people who didn't initially have technology, had physical packets. But definitely it's been a process in terms of supporting staff emotionally to make the adjustment, to feel comfortable, to feel empowered, to get that support that they need to make that technological switch. Has been a process that we still engage in. We do continue to meet regularly with them through Zoom or Google Meet to support their needs on a regular basis, and have developed similar types of Google platform sharing through Google folders and whatnot for staff to share and collaborate resources and strategies as well. So part of our focus has been on meeting the needs of learners in a flexible way. We were really following, especially after the federal guidance on March 21st, to really be very flexible in meeting their needs and individualizing instruction, including the provision and use of technology. Our main platform is Google Meet. We have tried to focus on that to support staff through that modality, and then right now we're focused on extending Google Chrome extensions and exploring those in order to help that process go more smoothly. We do have sometimes Wi-Fi issues for parents. So even if they have the technology, they have Wi-Fi, but sometimes there's connectivity issues that we continue to problem solve. We do have tech support available to families to reach out to, and our staff have been really helpful in terms of helping parents in that process. Right now it is flexible. It might be a face-to-face individual. There's also the video modeling that happens. Teachers are trying to follow their routines, especially for self-contained, and perhaps doing a morning meeting, either recorded or live through group instruction. So it's a combination. We are allowing teachers to do what makes sense for their classroom and their students based on their individual needs. Parents have also, obviously play a role in this. We currently have families who the parent may have coronavirus and now is no longer able to assist the child, right? We have families where the family's been displaced because they're being quarantined elsewhere because one of the parents may have illness. So we have been dealing with different situations as they're coming up and trying to be flexible to support the needs of the student, but also being sensitive to the fact that many families may not be really available right now to provide needed support to their child directly. Our behaviorists have been supportive of families, as have teachers, in terms of meeting individual behavioral needs. Some are pre-existing, some are newly developed as a result of closure. We did have students melting down because their bus did not show up the first day when it should have, and they were staying at home. So teachers were supporting families and students individually as needed for those types of issues, and as well as implementing their IEPs as much as possible to provide those supports that are indicated there. Paraprofessional support is something, the majority of my paras are program paras, and they have been, the first 2 weeks, they did RBT, Registered Behavior Technician Training, the 40-hour required training. There's a free online program that they participated in that. We use this as an opportunity to do professional development. And then other pairs have been used individually to meet the needs of students as per their IEPs and as per the current situation requiring that at this time. And that's typically been done through Google Meet. So you can go to the next slide. And that's really the para support has been both through ICR and through self-contained. So it really depends on the learner, not so much a certain program. It's really individually determined. One of the main emphasis we've been trying to maintain is to really have an open mind around the provision of services remotely, that to have positive expectations of ourselves and of our students, and to have the mindset that this is not just something we have to accept, but perhaps something that could actually go really well. And reframing, especially for our self-contained populations, that we have the opportunity now, because we're working with parents, to do some really good work with families in terms of generalizing skills and training them to support the student in all areas and facets of learning, right? So we work a lot on functional skills, on language skills, and here we have this opportunity to have that built into the child's home 24/7, with parents really being at the helm of that and being able to carry over what we've been teaching. And obviously there has been a need to problem solve specific behavioral difficulties as they've arisen, but this is where some of the use of positive behavior supports has been really helpful. Trying to build in prevention strategies. We've been supporting both related services and teachers with this. You have to kind of deal with the issues that come up, and you may not anticipate them because this is a different learning environment that the child is adjusting to, and we have to give them time to adjust and adjust our expectations accordingly. Parents also, in terms of structuring for success, that because of the nature of the teacher or related service provider not being directly present, it is important that there's planning involved and that there's advance notice of materials, and if reinforcement is needed, that we're guiding parents and caretakers as much as possible, so that can be a successful process, and the adjustment to online or virtual learning can be facilitated. There's also other behavioral techniques. We actually have a training for related service providers that my behavioral staff, you can go to the next slide, that's fine, that my behavioral staff are organizing at this time. It's going to occur on Friday to help further support related service providers who might be having some behavioral challenges with their individuals or groups. So our IEP process has continued as much as possible for both CST and related service providers. We are giving parents the option to wait to hold in-person meetings while also offering them online, virtual, or by phone. The majority of parents have opted to continue by phone, but we have had parents refuse and want to do in-person meetings, and they do have the right to do so. So we have afforded them that opportunity. The evaluation process, our eval planning continues. Obviously, there's limitations in terms of completing evals, but as much as possible, we are looking into, certainly social histories can be done, rating scales. We are looking into the possibility of telehealth for our psychiatric and neurodevelopmental evals to see if that might be a facet that might be able to be completed. And digital evaluation through Pearson is something we're exploring right now, possibly for speech and language, to see if that logistically might be a feasible option that might help the timeline issue. Obviously, eligibility meetings are delayed at this point because of needed evals. We are proceeding with eligibility for evaluations that say for suspected SLD, and the only thing holding it back might be an OT eval, right? So we can still determine eligibility, especially for initial eligibility, and provide services, and put a disclaimer in the IEP saying the special alerts that the OT eval is pending and will be, once completed, the IEP will be modified at that time. We are also at this point accepting email written consent during the school closure. Many of our parents lack technology, and the opportunity to provide written consent is limited, even despite CST attempts to instruct them. So we are now accepting that temporarily during the closure. Obviously, records request fulfillment becomes a challenge at this time. Despite our best intentions, we don't have access to all printed records and are unable to complete that. Support has been rendered to both CST and related services regularly. Some weeks it's been 3 times, but really it's typically 1 to 2 since we've been closed. Really based on their needs and what they require. And I do feel that has been helpful. They're supporting each other through this process. Certain people have brainstormed certain problems together on the phone, through this Zoom meeting or through a Google Meet. But we have found that really helpful in this process, that it's not just about here, this is what you need to do, but let's talk about how we can make this a better adjustment for ourselves and for our students. And as I mentioned previously, we're also extending that and moving into having our district behaviorists support both related service providers. And then the following week, we'll likely move that towards gen ed and special ed teachers as well. And another thing that's been really helpful for me personally as a director who's had to manage this whole process as we've been going along, in order to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on and what issues are coming up, I have active Google Docs of questions that they're able to add. And then that tells me, oh, we need to meet, or I need to get more information to them out immediately on this. So that we've had open since pretty much even right before we closed and right into after we closed. And that has been really instrumental, especially making my meetings more productive, because then we're able to vet some of those questions and get answers and solutions by the time we meet together. Thank you. I don't know if anyone has any specific questions for any of us. I guess we'll open it up for questions.
So one of the general questions is for all 3 of our district representatives, what was the most challenging aspect of trying to adjust to this remote environment? If you had to pick one area of addressing the needs of students with disabilities, what was that most challenging aspect?
Hi, it's Blair. I'll go first. I think it's the balance of doing enough where we are meeting their needs as per FAPE, and we're meeting the needs of them virtually while also balancing the parents' needs and what they're saying in terms of what the children need. So I do think finding that balance took a few weeks because I think everyone in our world was and is in a state of shock. So that I think has been the most challenging, is making sure that we feel that we're doing what we should be doing because it's what the child is legally entitled to have, while also considering and balancing the needs of their family, the needs of the child, and what this is going to look like in their new school environment.
I would say this is Dr. Taylor. I would say it was the related service provision. The state really didn't go. I mean, I'm very thankful that the state Board of Ed approved that today, but we're 2.5 weeks in. And it's left a lot of questions about the extent to which we provide related services, especially after the US Department of Ed gave out guidance on the 21st. Clearly we needed to do something, but we had some limitations set forth in the state that were set forth at a time when face-to-face was possible. So I felt that put us in a really bad position as districts the past 2 weeks.
So John, one specific question for you. If a school district was in the middle of evaluating a student and was forced to close, how should that school district proceed, given that they were only half done with the process?
Well, what I would say is if they were able to do necessary assessments to complete the initial eval, then they could probably complete the process. If not, I would proceed as I discussed and do everything you can do, and then complete the process when schools reopen and you're able to do whatever tasks you're just not able to do while you're closed. When you can finally do them when schools reopen, complete it as soon as possible. At that point, you have no other choice. You can't complete the process and make an eligibility determination unless you have all the information you determined in the nature and scope in the ID meeting that you need in order to make the determination. So if you're not able to do that, do everything you can, and then finish as quickly as possible when you reopen.
So I will say for folks who are listening to our presentation, we are going to try to capture the other questions that we haven't been able to answer. I do want to address a question that I saw a number of times that I probably should have addressed right at the very beginning. We are going to be posting today's webinar, NJPSA website, njpsa.org. When you go to our homepage, you will see a link for coronavirus-related resource documents and a link to all of the free webinars that we are providing. Typically, we have been able to post the recorded webinar within an hour or so of completing the webinar, and we will be posting the PowerPoint that goes with the webinar. That PowerPoint includes all of the links that you saw in our presentation today, including the links at the very beginning that you can just click on and register for any of the other free webinars and workshops that we are offering over the next several weeks. So we will have that PowerPoint with live links built into it. That PowerPoint will also include links to a number of very important resource documents. So we want to give you some great tools to move forward, and we give you a number of resource documents from the U.S. Department of Education. You can see those resource documents. We also give you resource documents from the New Jersey Department of Education. And again, if individuals go to the NJPSA website, njpsa.org, on our homepage, you will see a link that takes you to our free upcoming webinars. And when you scroll down, you will see posted today's webinar and all of the free prior webinars that we have been offering since the school closures. So we're trying to make this information as readily accessible as possible. And we do encourage you to share the information with others as well, because we know you need all the support that we can give you in this challenging time. I want to thank all of our presenters today for just the incredible information that you've put forward. I'm sure it's going to be very helpful to those in the field, and I know that we're all inspired by the great work that we heard about from both the Livingston and Jackson school districts. So thank you very much for your great work. For those who are interested, we know that, of course, in this remote environment, we do need to pay attention to ongoing professional development needs for our staff. So we've also given you a link here to a number of other Legal One webinars that we already were planning to offer and are offering for folks who are interested on a wide range of topics. So thank you, everybody, for participating today. Again, today's webinar will be posted probably within an hour or so, and we'll be posting that PowerPoint with active links that allow you to register for all of our other upcoming sessions as well. And we hope that this has been helpful for all of you, and appreciate all the great work that you're doing on behalf of our children.